I'm Terry Campbell, and this is Arts National. 9 years ago, this country lost one of its greatest musical artists, a man who lives on, though, in our hearts and in our record collections, Glenn Gould. Tonight, on what would have been his 59th birthday, we're rebroadcasting a special tribute to Glenn Gould that we originally aired almost 2 years ago. That was back in October of 1989, because it is time to remember. I never had the opportunity to work with Glenn Gould, but for several years I saw him just about every day, I guess. Glenn had a small office in the CBC radio building in Toronto, and as was his nocturnal habit, he'd work there through the night. His cue to put on the old overcoat and hat and the ever-present gloves was my arrival in the pre-dawn hours to host Stereo Morning. We'd pass in the hall, exchange pleasantries, if his mind wasn't focused on another project, and it often was, and he would go off into the dark. This evening we'll be hearing from many of the people who did have close associations with Glenn Gould and his music, from radio and television hosts Vincent Tovell and Ken Haslam, producers David Yeager and Janet Somerville, and technician Lorne Tulk. From the University of Toronto, musicologist Harvey Olnick. And from the world of music, Lois Marshall, Roxolana Roslak, and Nicholas Goldschmidt. Each has special memories and perspectives about Glenn Gould. Tonight, Arts National is a scrapbook, a family album, the life of a musician, a communicator, a personality who, from his special and separate space, drew us to him in Canada and around the globe, drew us into his world, alive with ideas and intimate with music.
It's difficult to believe that he died 7 years ago, because he was and remains so vivid. And of course, it's wonderful now there's a biography. Otto Friedrich's biography has come out, which tells a great deal that sets the story out in clear and interesting terms. And I think in that book he points out that it would probably amuse and intrigue and perhaps even delight Glenn a certain amount that we're still interested in the variety of his personality and the first, last, and foremost, the quality of his musicianship and the contribution that he made to the great questions about music and the ability that is shown in his recordings to make music such an intimate experience for people individually, and yet worldwide distributed. This goes back to Glenn being himself in his own place, in his own way, speaking of the past and to the future, using the modern media, true to himself and true as he understood it to the music he was transmitting.
I have an early memory of Glenn. I think I probably am maybe 5 years older than Glenn. And we were both very young. I might have been 20, he might have been 15 or some such age. And we were doing something for the symphony committee. And we were at someone's house. It was a grand place. And I think I sang some Spanish songs. Glenn played the Italian concerto. And I remember that Sir Ernest Macmillan was there, and everybody was totally just, over the moon with Glenn's playing at that age. I mean, it wasn't just his facility, it was everything he had inside, Anyhow, when it was over, Sir Ernest came and said, well, if I could play that piece, that's the way I would like to have played it, which I thought was a wonderful compliment and absolutely justified.
think, in the hall in the Royal Conservatory of Music. In the very early days when I started to be in charge of the opera school, he was a very young boy. I think he studied with Guerrero at that time, running around like a very jolly good fellow boy. That's when I saw him the first time in my life. But of course, we all knew there was quite a young man in that school who we are all going to watch with great interest. And I recall when he made his first appearance in Massey Hall. That was one of those great moments where I think he was about 13 or 14 years old. I don't know, but I recall it with enormous interest. And then, of course, later on...
It was the first year that I was at the Faculty of Music, which was housed in the Royal Conservatory. A colleague of mine came up and said he couldn't go to a concert or didn't want to, I don't know. He offered me tickets if I would give him a review. I said, what the hell not? He said, he's a peculiar fellow, well, a quirky pianist, but very good, very good. So I went, and the program was sponsored by an organization called New Music Associates. That's what it was called. New Music Associations, I learned later, was one of Glenn's organizations designed to support the music of Schoenberg in a reluctant Toronto. But oddly enough, the program for this concert was all Bach. Came on with a rush, and he said, he was a quirky-looking fellow. But the moment he started playing, I was just struck by the rhythm. And that's one of the qualities that knocked me out. And then after the brief intermission, he came out and played the Goldberg Variations. Well, the Goldberg Variations were played by Wanda Landowska and by Rosalind Turek, but not by many people, and certainly not in the concert. And when Glenn started playing that, it seemed to combine on the piano the qualities of a harpsichord, because he played on the whole non-legato. And he could afford to do that because his sensitivity to rhythm was so extraordinary, in fact dazzling. It just bowled me over. That was 1954, and that review, by the way, appeared, I think was the first thing that was written about Glenn in anything in the U.S. But in the next year, that is the same season, in February, I think, he gave his concert in Washington, which was reviewed in a sensational way in the Washington Journal. And a week later, I think, he played his concert, the same concert in Town Hall. I knew this was such an extraordinary talent that I called friends up in New York, and particularly Mrs. Rosalie Leventrit, who was the doyenne of the Leventrit Prize, the most prestigious, by the way, musical prize at that time. And I told her to get the young pianists of New York to go, and to go herself. And I thought it was exceptional enough, so I sort of twisted around and told her to give a party, something after the concert at Town Hall, which she volunteered to do and did. Unfortunately, at the party, Glenn began to feel a little bit uncomfortable, as he often did when there were a lot of people around with whom he couldn't, shall we say, control or have in his pocket. And so he actually begged off and left the party probably hardly as it began. Mrs. Leventry called me the next morning and said, "What kind of a character have you sent me?" And I also had called, by the way, one or two people at Columbia Records, and she called. But the result of it was that I think Glenn was signed by David Oppenheim and Goddard Lieberson the following day after that concert.
And then, of course, later on, the real bang, I would call it, happened when he did the first set of the Goldberg Variations. And there, I never forget, one day I ran into him again in the hall in the Royal Conservatory, and he had Time magazine. Man said, "Nicky, look at that, look at that, look at that." I said, "What is it? What they write about me?" I said, "Well, that's what I expected. After all, you do that very well." And he laughed and went all over the place. And that was very endearing. You know, he was thrilled. And he had a boyish nature, always. He always had that.
Well, the organ was a great influence, not only on my later taste in repertoire, but I think also on the physical manner in which I tried to play the piano. It was an invaluable training. It's something that I think a lot of people could profit by. I was playing the organ when I was around 9 or 10 for the first time, and I was playing mostly, I would say, no, altogether, to be quite honest, Bach and Handel. And it was really, I think, through the organ that this interest began, and it was simply transferred to the piano.
And then did you switch to the piano afterwards?
No, I was playing the piano at the same time. It was a question of trying to combine this with going to school, which got very difficult, and eventually something had to give, and it was the organ that gave. But by that time, certain aspects of organ playing, the physical aspects of organ playing, had made a great impression upon me. I learned that when you played Bach, the only way to establish a phrase, a subject, a motive of any kind, was not to do as one would do with Chopin, to make a dynamic crescendo or diminuendo in the middle of the thing, but was to establish it by rhythmic gasps and breaths. And in other words, that when we're playing the art of the fugue, let's say, you do not play it. Which it would seem to be, if it were Chopin, I mean, one could only imagine it as. That is not Chopin, but if it were that repertoire, if it were something from the 19th century, one would play it that way. But when it was Bach, one had to have an entirely different approach, something that was based really on the tips of the fingers, doing the whole action for you, something that could be, almost have the wonderful whistling gasp of the tracker action of the old organs of the. invention of expressions generally was accomplished with practically none of the slurrings and the overphrasings and not to even speak of pedalings, in which Bach is so often played on the piano. And I really feel that this was entirely due to the fact that I was trained in the organ.
So low in the chair, in his chair, and it was that he could then have his hand high, and since his technique was essentially a finger technique, he used to be able to snap his fingers individually and have that very particular rhythmic sensitivity that I've never encountered from anybody else in my life. He was the first guy who played Bach on the piano, that, to my knowledge, which had this very clear distinction of style between the recitativo type of thing, the vocal, the human voice utterances of irregular rhythms and passion and what have you. And at the same time, he could make you feel like dancing when the dance-like rhythms came along, how they bounced and shot. No one made that clear distinction and did it as well. And I don't know anybody to this day who can.
I always felt with Glenn in playing Bach that I wouldn't want to listen to anybody else play it, because you could hear everything. You could hear every voice, where it was going. It was incredible, the clarity, you know. And other people, when I listen, and they're very good, I mean, some wonderful Bach players, but it's not like that. You don't have that crystal clarity. And I found the same when he played Schoenberg, which I didn't understand even really. But when I listened to Glenn play it, I could see I could feel the whole structure of the music. The whole architecture of the piece was just there for you, to behold.
He was very interested in all kind of music. You know, so many people identify him with Bach and Schoenberg and Berg, even in his contrasting styles, but he was a phenomenal interpreter of those three composers. But apart from his Beethoven performances, but the thing which many people did not realize, that he was a true romantic. I mean, you know, in his later years, he transcribed for piano all kind of things, including the Siegfried Idyll of Wagner, and he transcribed, I think, the Meistersinger Overture, all kind of things. So he was, I would say, a true Renaissance man within the musical literature. And that, of course, was the enormous appeal of his personality, that he could change from one to the other.
He recorded those Brahms intermezzi, and I accused him of being a hidden romantic, because they were as effusive and expressive as anything I've ever heard in my life. And he was offended by being called romantic. He didn't want to be typed in any way.
Romantic, I mean, it just depends how you choose to interpret or define the word romantic or a sense of romance. I think he was extremely emotional. I think his responses were very emotional on a very deep emotional level. Now, he chose a certain way to express that emotion, but I think the emotion was very strong, and it was very much there. So in that sense, yes.
What music? It's Bruckner, the string quintet.
It's much more romantic than anything I expected to hear you play, Glenn.
It's the most wonderful thing he ever wrote, I think. The only thing in which you can't have the tubas blasting out every climax. You know? Puts him under a greater discipline than he ever was in any other work. Marvelous music.
Instruments, I suppose you can only play it for yourself.
Well, I have more pleasure playing Bruckner on the piano than most other things of that generation that were written for the piano, as a matter of fact. And to me, it's a source of greatest regret, really, that the people that I admire most at the turn of the century, Mahler and Strauss and so on, wrote nothing of consequence for the piano.
It's been said often that there's a peculiar quality, some people have called ecstasy, in his playing. And that doesn't mean some vague sort of romantic kind of highfalutin thing at all. It means an intensity. And yet, his lyrical playing is the most relaxing, the most flowing kind of lyricism, very much part of his nature. And for all his reputation as a pianist in the Baroque music, literature, Bach. And so many people think he never did anything but Bach. But listen to the Brahms ballades, or listen to the Brahms intermezzi, or listen to the Wagner transcriptions. And you hear Glenn as a singer, and I don't mean the voice in the background, although you may hear that occasionally. But that part of his nature that was lyrical, enormously important, that communicated when you knew him personally. It did communicate. He was very romantic. Some people are born stars, and he was a born star. I'm told he was a star as a child, too. Lovable, unlike a lot of people who are born stars. Glenn was truly lovable. He was funny. He was, in a certain way, unpredictable. His calling you at 3 in the morning with some new thing that had excited him. Sometimes it was he got the first pressing of a new recording and he wanted to share it. And sharing is the word. Not boast of it, but share in the excitement of it.
Glenn was not a lonely man, but he was a loner throughout his life, I found. But he would occasionally have need of a certain person to either speak with or try out something, even at 2:30 in the morning when he would phone and wake us out of a deep sleep, because he never slept, I'm sure, that man. He would be working in his studio, and many is the time that he would call me in the wee hours of the morning to try out something, and I'd mutter and mumble and half asleep. And the next time I saw him, I'd say, Glenn, for Pete's sake, don't phone me at 2:30 in the morning, please. Oh, did I really disturb you?
I got late night telephone calls after our working relationship. I was going to say ceased. It didn't really cease. It was just that it was put on hold sometimes for long periods. And that's when I would have late night telephone calls, except that he wouldn't call me, I would call him. We had an arrangement whereby he would not wake up the rest of the house. And since he was alone, I would simply call him. But more often than having late night telephone calls, he would oftentimes come and meet me and pick me up at work or up at the corner when I'd be walking home or something, and I'd get to the corner of Sherbourne and Bloor sometimes around 1:30 or so in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning. He'd always be there because he said that's where he'd get his newspaper. And he always got, he would read. He was an insatiable reader. And he would read 3 or 4 newspapers a day, and starting with the first one that he'd get in the early morning. So he would sort of just happen to be there when I was there. It was always coincidence, 3 or 4 times a week. I never, ever questioned it. It was just, isn't this coincidence? He always arrived when I did. So he would drive me home, and we'd get into the house. Or sometimes we'd sit in the car for an hour or 2 hours, and he'd leave the engine running for 2 or 3 hours and just sit there and talk. And we'd talk about everything. Or sometimes, instead of sitting in the car, we'd go in the house, and I would make him scrambled eggs. I think that's why he drove me home. He loved scrambled eggs.
I could tell you a lovely story which he tells himself, about himself, which showed actually his incredible sense of humor and laughing about himself. That the story was the following. He had a studio up near Orillia in the country and had a house there. And that's where he practiced for hours. And the farmer's wife next door generally brought him lunch or dinner, I don't know, and more or less perhaps cleaned his house, I have no idea. But anyway, the story was this. One day this farmer's wife came in, and he was lying on the couch, exhausted, looking exhausted. He had to practice and practice. And she came in and said, Mr. Gould, here's your lunch. I can't eat lunch. I'm too tired. You have to eat something, Mr. Gould. No, I don't. Whereupon, and that he says himself, whereupon the farmer's wife said, Mr. Gould, such a nice young man as you are, why don't you look for a decent job? Now that is enchanting when you say it about yourself.
He was a fun guy. He really was. He loved a good joke. Sometimes they were a little coarse, as some of, I don't mean off color, but they were sort of bunctious, rough humor, and which he enjoyed immensely, and which didn't seem to me at any rate quite that subtle. And he did these imitations that the critics and the musicologists and I don't know what, and he just enjoyed that himself. I don't think he would have been allowed to do any of those things. In fact, to pontificate on problems of philosophy and what have you and all that, if he weren't the great pianist.
I think that he was aware what an extraordinary pianist he was. But at the same time, he was a terribly modest boy. That's what I had to feel, that he had this endearing quality, and his idiosyncrasies, I think they were genuine, but sometimes I felt, well, maybe it's a little bit showmanship. I'll give you an example. In Vancouver, at the time when he gave a recital in the Queen Elizabeth Theatre, and he came out with his gloves on, slouched on the stage, you know. Then he took them off. And then there was the glass of water on the piano. And then he started to talk about the program he's going to play, and talked and talked. And suddenly an old lady in front of me said, "Mr. Gould, I've paid a lot of money to hear you. Why don't you sit down and play?" That was one of those typical things of him, and he smiled, said, "All right," and sat down.
An audience collectively doesn't mean very much to me. I don't think that I'm able to make any real comparison, because it seems to me that an audience is there for only one purpose, and that is to listen. They are not there to respond. They are not there to applaud. As far as I'm concerned, I have always hoped to fulfill an ambition when I'm 60 that I had when I was 16, and that was to found my own concert series in my own concert hall, in which it would be verboten for the audience to respond in any way, to applaud, to jeer, to whistle, to do anything. Because it seems to me that applause and response of any kind is not only a misleading thing, it can be a vicious instrument. It can be an instrument that can cause a lot of people who are easily impressed by their own success to go astray. It can also discourage many who are somewhat more weak-willed. And altogether, I think it should be done away with.
Are you saying that audiences can affect your performance in the sense that they can influence you to show off, say, or to do something?
Definitely. I've tried to make it so that in the last few years I've worked very hard to convince myself that the audience, for all practical purposes, does not exist, that I'm playing really for myself, and that getting up and taking your bow is simply a formality that has to be gone through and not something to be concerned about in any way. I mean, this sounds like hokum, but it really can be done. I'm convinced of it. In fact, my own feeling now about an audience is much more one of healthy indifference, not antagonism, and certainly not disdain, but one in which they are simply invited to sit in on something that is happening in any case for yourself, you know. This is the only way in which you can really be at ease and I think in intimate contact with the audience, actually, because you have to consider them individually, not for their mass response. It is just as if you were playing for a few friends who unfortunately got too many, you know.
He was very eccentric in many ways, and that was certainly one. He loved the studio, and he loved all the recording paraphernalia and experimenting with everything. but apparently an audience just didn't do anything for him. And it's really... I was always at my best in singing before the public. I felt isolated, you know. I didn't feel that as long as there was some space between me and the public out there, I could totally concentrate. In a recording studio, it was really painful for me. I always did my utmost, my ultimate utmost, but it was never the same as when I could just walk out on the platform. Something sort of took over for me. Glenn was the opposite, so it's just, that's all I can say. I don't know.
He had no inhibitions from the point of view being himself, and at the same time, he hated, I think genuinely, to have to perform for 3,000 people. And there was some kind of a, I don't call it idiosyncrasy or, I don't know. There was something there which didn't work. And he finally gave it up, although I think his prophecy has partly come true. Recitals are very difficult to sell these days.
As he got more and more famous, he was less and less inclined to listen to criticism. And I still remember one time when we had just had dinner. This is about the time in 64, I think, something like that, when he was giving up his public appearances. And whereas the earlier relationship was fun, where you felt you could say anything you wanted, later on, it was less fun. And on this occasion, he was at a concert, I think, 2 or 3 days later. When I suggested, let's have a chat after dinner, Glenn said, no, better not. I have to play in 3 days. Well, that seemed like a strange thing. So I got the notion that if I had talked to him and was, you know, had a free exchange of notions, it would somehow damage his ego, and he wouldn't be able to play with such sufficient assurance 3 days hence. And that seemed a little strange to me. But we rather cooled off at that point.
In my teens, I was going to school, and I played almost not at all in public. My only performances, really, for many years, were performances on the CBC, who were extremely good to me. And I got so used to working with a microphone that the microphone, instead of becoming an enemy, as it does for many people, it became a friend. I really think that this is not so common, because I know most people fear and detest the microphone, and it's most unfortunate, because when you get to feel at ease with it, it becomes the most relaxed and intimate medium there is. Recording is a wonderful joy to me, because it's the closest thing to recreation that we have. Really. And then the playback aspect of recording is a very satisfying thing too, because you can listen to many different variants of the same thing and find the closest thing to the ideal, never the ideal, but the closest to it that you were able to achieve at that particular moment in your life.
We visited his studio. He had a studio at Front Street at that time, and we went in for a splice test, as a lot of his acquaintances did. He was very defensive about about editing tape, because there were artists who also took very public positions about the necessity that tape not be edited, and of course this was an approach that Glenn would never embrace, and so he was collecting statistics on whether people were able to hear splices in tape. I kind of beg the question, really, I think, because if a splice is made perfectly, you don't hear it. The whole point of making a splice is not to hear it, at least in classical music. And, well, they weren't very easy to hear, and you didn't catch many of them. And he published his statistics in several articles, I think. And I don't know if it was ever really that necessary to make the point, but he felt it was. Of course, he would show you the scores of his own recordings. He would show how they had been marked. And they were like a highway map. It was a patchwork. It was an amazing schematic of splicing, regeneration, insertion, things cut back into one another, and so on. And things cut together and then regenerated and then cut back into the fabric of the piece. He was a student of that particular technique, and of course it had to be perfect. And it was perfect.
He was in charge. I saw him doing things when he manipulated sound computers, I don't know if you ever saw his studio. I mean, there were so many gadgets and things. I never knew which button to press. But he had the time of his life doing this. And he was far ahead of his time. He knew what technology would produce eventually.
You sit at the front, it says. Well, let's try anyway, see what happens.
This is the difference in Glenn Gould.
In 4 years.
In 4 years. When Glenn first came in here, not only didn't he care about the financial page, he couldn't read the financial page.
Right.
This morning, at 11:15, he's not only able to read the financial page, he's able to find out what the value of the Canadian dollar is. This should be a straight piano solo without vocal obligato.
I think he needed some lessons. Oh, Glenn, he was irrepressible that way. I mean, I think it's too bad that some of that's so audible on the records, but most people don't mind it at all.
It was sort of his world, and it was his home, And he felt very comfortable in that situation. And as a result, I felt he was very relaxed. You felt he was having such a wonderful time. He was excited about it. He was having a great time. He wanted you to have a great time. And he wanted not just you, me, but he wanted all the engineers and all the technicians, everybody who was there. He really wanted for them to really have a wonderful time because he was having a good time. And so really that's the way I remember the recording sessions. All of them were essentially, had that, the overriding feeling would have been that.
Roxolana Roslak and Glenn Gould, Von der Hochzeit zu Kana, by Paul Hindemith. The recording of that song cycle, Das Marienleben, won the Juno Award for Best Classical Album of the Year in 1978. This is an evening of and about Glenn Gould on Arts National, a scrapbook of memories and impressions from musical friends Nicholas Goldschmidt, Lois Marshall, Roxolana Roslak, and Harvey Olnick. Gould, the broadcaster, the communicator, whose ideas took shape on radio and television, is remembered by producers Janet Somerville and David Yeager, by technician Lauren Tulk, and by hosts Ken Haslam and Vincent Tovell.
Glenn, I believe, was a rooted person. He stayed in Toronto because it was, of course, practical, convenient. New York was accessible for professional reasons when he needed to go there, and he went there less and less as he got older. He could live his life as he wanted to live it, and he could do his work as he wanted to do his work in a place that was, I was just going to say home, but I'm not really sure that Glenn ever had a specific home. He had one childhood home up until his Declaration of Independence, when he really needed to have a separate place to live, and so he left home and moved into an apartment. But in fact, what is, I think, important about Glenn was that he was rooted socially in a community which he understood very well, in a city that was, from his point of view, perfect because he could detach himself from it, keep his privacy, he could go away from it or be in it, and nobody knew whether he was or wasn't here, except those whom he wished to tell. And the CBC was here. The CBC in Toronto was Glenn's comfortable place.
Glenn was haunting the radio building, mostly in the evening. Glenn had a kind of a cubby hole in one corner. It was piled up high with books and papers and music, and probably about 2 feet underneath there was probably a typewriter. And the first time I met him, I was going about doing my record programming, and there was this gentleman in the coat with the hat on, kind of scruffy-looking guy, who was kind of just around. I get the impression that radio music was a very important pillar in his day-to-day existence. I mean, he wasn't there a lot, but he needed to maintain that contact. He needed to know that he could be there. In 1975, he had suggested that we should do a series of programs on Schoenberg in honor of the centennial. And I was at that time producing a program called Music of Today. And we did 10 programs together, co-hosted by Glenn and Ken Haslam.
Who will be heard asking the inevitable question, why Schoenberg?
Surely you're not going to be a centennial party pooper, sir?
No, certainly not, Glenn. I'm only too aware of the immense influence Schoenberg has had on 20th century music, on 20th century art altogether, indeed. But isn't it permissible to admit the extent of that influence, to concede him a secure place in history, if you will, without at the same time denying the fact that, for me at least, and I think I represent a fair body of public opinion in this respect, Schoenberg is one of the least ingratiating composers of modern times.
I think that's fair, and I think that's his dilemma, Ken.
Oh, and I don't just mean ingratiating, or rather uningratiating vis-a-vis his more accessible contemporaries, Hindemith, Bartók, and so on. Now, I personally find that a good deal of the music written subsequent to his death, some by his disciples and some not, is infinitely more accessible, at least to my eardrums.
Are you waiting for me to disagree?
Well, Glenn, I happen to know that you've recorded virtually every note that Schoenberg ever penned for the piano. The concerto, of course, all the solo piano music, eh?
Yeah.
Oh, and all the lieder, I guess. And all the chamber music.
No, not all. I've never recorded Pierrot Lunaire.
Well, almost all at any rate, and that surely bespeaks advocacy of a kind.
Well, I suppose. Certainly Schoenberg's music has meant a great deal to me, Ken. I first became...
Glenn wrote every single word that I spoke. We would get into flaming arguments occasionally. Oh, that sounds terrible. I don't mean that we were tearing of hair. But I'd say, Glenn, that line is not me. It isn't me. I can't say it the way you want. But he had composed this again. I use the word composition. He had composed this script. And I really got down to the point I said, look, Glenn, I can't do it that way. It's not me. It'll be false. It won't be real. So eventually he would grudgingly admit that, well, perhaps we could do such and such and so, or it would end up on the cutting room floor or whatever. But that was an interesting thing. No, anytime we worked together, it was, the whole creation was there on paper, with possible little changes here and there. So there was nothing in the sense of spontaneity, no. The spontaneity all occurred in off-mic hours.
It was really Glenn's production. I had very little to do with it because everything was set, everything was determined, when it arrived in the studio. He was very, very eager to have approval. He was very eager for people to agree with his ideas. He would, from time to time, ask my opinion about things, but it was really not so much that he needed to have, the information from me, so much as for he needed to kind of touch wood and know that the people he was working with were really with him. Because the one thing I noticed with Glenn is that he did achieve a kind of perfection in his work, and I think he was the sort of person who, when he said something, or when he did something, or when he wrote or played, it really was exactly in the form that he wished it to be. I think it was the first experience in my life that I ever witnessed and really experienced a person for whom perfection was so nearly attainable. I don't think I had really ever encountered a person prior to then that tried to live, to that principle.
This is Glenn Gould, and this program is called The Idea of North. I've long been intrigued by that incredible tapestry of tundra and taiga which constitutes the Arctic and subarctic of our country. I've read about it, written about it, and even pulled up my parka once and gone there. Yet, like all but a very few Canadians, I've had no real experience of the North. I've remained, of necessity, an outsider. And the North has remained, for me, a convenient place to dream about, spin tall tales about, and in the end, avoid. This program, however, brings together some remarkable people who have had a direct confrontation with that northern third of Canada, who've lived and worked there, and in whose lives the North has played a very vital role. There's a geographer and anthropologist, Jim Lotz, a sociologist, Frank Valley, a government official, Brian Phillips,
stays out of his way, and one books hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studio hours if one possibly can get away with it. The function of a producer in a Glenn Gould radio documentary is to get the studio time and to help keep the technician happy and absorbed, because Glenn Gould only did things 1,000%, and his preferred working pattern was to work all night. So he and Lorne Tulg would work all night. It was quite beautiful. Aesthetically, it was quite beautiful. Lorne and Glenn would work with just the lights from the actual board, not the overhead lights. Not talking very much, quite, rapt, listening to the sounds. Well, Lorne watching Glenn Lorne absorbed in trying to understand what Glenn wanted, what he was trying to get. And Glenn completely caught up body and soul in the sound and in the possibilities of the sound and in the sound that only he could hear that wasn't physically audible yet. Glenn was very articulate about what he was trying to get. He used some misleading words at first, and it finally dawned on me that he may not have understood the usual meaning of some of the words. Like he often called it aleatoric radio. Remember aleatoric art back in the late 50s and early 60s, which was basically chance art, things thrown together as if by chance. Well, the idea of North is not aleatoric, anything but. Every conjunction of all four layers was meticulously planned and worked for many hours. And it certainly wasn't magic. It was the hard work of Lorne Tulloch that made that thing come real.
Cockpit with the pilot, and I was forever looking out, left and right, and I could see ice floes over the Hudson's Bay, and I was always looking for a polar bear or some seals that I could spot, but unfortunately there were none. And as we flew along the east coast of Hudson's Bay, this flat
I don't go, let me say this again, I don't go for this northmanship bit at all.
Because it just seemed endless.
I don't...
we seemed to be going into nowhere.
Those people who do claim that
and
they
the further north we went,
farther north and so on. But I see it as a kind of a game, this northmanship bit, with people saying, well, were you ever up at the North Pole? And how I did a dog sled trip of 22 days, and the other fellow said, well, I did one of 30 days.
For another 11 years.
Perhaps they would see themselves as more
Sure, the North has changed my life. I can't conceive of anyone being in close touch with the North, whether he lived there all the time or simply traveled it month after month, year after year. I can't conceive of such a person being really untouched by the North for the rest of his life. When I left in 1965, at least left the job,
it goes on like this, as though there's some special...
It wasn't because of being tired
merit,
of the
some
North,
virtue to being in the North, or some special virtue in having been with the primitive people. What special virtue was there in that? And,
it is most difficult to describe.
I find, I suppose,
it was extreme isolation.
I think I'd be more
this is very
interested in
true.
Baker Lake.
And I knew very well I could not go anywhere except for a mile or two walking. I always think of the long summer nights when the snow had melted, the lakes were open, and the geese and ducks had started to fly out. During that time, the sun would set, but when there was still the last shimmer in the sky, I would walk out to one of those lakes and watch those ducks and geese just fly around peacefully or sitting on the water. And I felt that I was almost part of that country, part of that peaceful surrounding, and I wished that it would never end.
If I'm perfectly honest about it, we were at least halfway through, or maybe more than halfway through the project before I really understood what we were doing. We were painting a sound picture. We were painting an oral display for the ears. He had chosen voices for their texture so that they would ride on each other. The tonality of the voices would. And he had really heard these and tried to work them together so they would ride on each other. And it really shows in the prologue and in the epilogue. That's where it shows most of all. But, and throughout the show, I began to get the feel of what he wanted in the texture. But as we were good halfway through, we'd been working together on that project, I guess we've been working together for several weeks before I fully appreciated or understood what it was he was doing.
Him. We don't seem to realize there's another end to this, that he is manipulating us. We have some detailed evidence on this in George River. But, because we say, the wonderful
which at that time was quite a place to which yes, we were moving. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
And he will play this only insofar as it sort of keeps us happy.
A few hundred working in the
I think
mines.
there's something fairly insidious about
There was a great deal of dispute going on as to whether this
Well, in our impatience, and the our here, I think, is the people of Canada, or people of Canada who have some interest in the North.
In their nature to observe the
I think we've often tended to do a disservice to Northerners
by putting them in places they shouldn't quite be. That is, putting them in places they haven't earned themselves. Putting them in places
in the art of
which we hope they will earn themselves.
Debates, that is, about...
There's a tendency at times to show one's respectability anywhere in this continent by having on your board of directors a tame Negro or a tame female or a tame Indian.
Any white woman who goes north has a very specific purpose.
The north. It comes
Usually she's married to a man who is with the Department of Northern Affairs or whatever.
But there is behind it a sort
so the wife accompanies her husband.
We tend to
she
say,
probably has a
look,
number of small children.
We're terribly good fellows.
It was groundbreaking, but in a way, it was a failure, eh? I mean, it was not followed up because as radio, in fact, it was quite unsuccessful. The feedback that we got, people phoned in, all right, several people phoned in. They phoned in to say there was something wrong with the station and they couldn't get it clearly. They thought it was interference. And two writers, one was William Littler, and I can't remember who the other one was, wrote about it very sympathetically. And after Glenn had done it, several advertising people tried building ads that way, because you can do it in a 30-second module quite a bit more easily than you can do it in a 58-minute one. And as far as I know, there were no other attempts at imitating it, because I think, by and large, it was agreed that it was a fascinating concept, but an unsuccessful construct. He continued to work with the concept in the next two, the Latecomers, and the Stokowski piece he did, and the Newfoundland program. But he backed off from the strictly musical mode that he had in mind with the Idea of North. Really, he was composing a kind of fugue, which had a very special relationship with the orchestral music that he chose for the background of the Idea of North. That was the part I didn't understand. I don't have a musical enough mind to follow what he was working at there. But it wasn't, again, it wasn't mysterious. It was almost a mathematical relationship that Glenn had in mind. And he moved away from trying to sculpture music without any instruments, with only words and timbre and the rhythm of language. He tried it too strictly in the Idea of North, and it really, people couldn't enjoy it very much. So in the next three programs that he worked out with Lorne Tulloch, he withdrew from, I would say, from the rigidity, from the ideological fervor that he was working out of with the Idea of North. And I think the last two programs were quite a bit more mellifluous. They sometimes played audaciously, but they were much easier to listen to. That was not my influence, believe me. That was Glenn's own evolution. You don't influence Glenn Gould.
Never be clever for the sake of being clever, for a canon in inversion is a dangerous diversion, and a bit of augmentation is a serious temptation. While a strengthened illusion is an obvious solution, while a stretchy diminution is a very, very obvious solution. So never be clever for the sake of being clever, for the sake of showing off.
I think there were other grounds on which he might like to have stood that he didn't. I think he probably would love to have been a composer. He did manage to compose a couple of minor things, but and they're actually quite good, I suppose. But I really think he would like to have had his place in the realm of composition as a great composer. I do believe that was true, although he never spoke of it. Not to me. I do believe it was a desire.
I think he considered himself a composer. And if you look at what he did with music, I think he took the music and I think he processed it, and I think he recomposed it through his performance. And you look at, for example, what he did with the Sibelius piano pieces, where he recorded them from several different perspectives on multi-track tape, and then cross-faded between perspectives, close, far, medium perspective, seemingly for expressive aims. When you look at his radio documentaries, it's clear that he considered himself a composer. He considered himself to be a sound artist, an artist who worked in sound. And I said to him at one point that I would like to publish an article about the 6 symphonies of Glenn Gould. And of course I was thinking of his tape documentaries. And I said that I considered them to be musical creations. Call them symphonies if you like. And he was flattered by that. He said he would very much like that. He would very much encourage that, and he said he'd be prepared to collaborate. I unfortunately have chosen the profession of producer as my life's work, and as a producer I have worked with tape and not with the pen. So I never wrote those articles. I sincerely had intended to, but I did believe that they were musical creations, and that was certainly part of his attitude. That was part of his musical personality, his musical makeup. Yeah, he was a composer. No question.
Well, I think the communications world that he drifted to was more a compensation for not being the composer that he wanted to be. I think that was his fundamental desire, and I was very close to him at the time when he wrote his string quartet, and he used to phone me sometimes at 1 o'clock in the morning and tell me, and then insist on playing the piano, the entire quartet up to the point he had last played it, and then adding 2 or 3 measures. That was the achievement of those compositions, and looking for approval about that from me. Not that I could even determine what it was, but he labored, worked like a dog on it. There's no question about it. It was a long time, and it was his fervent hope to do that. And I think that, for example, even the communication stuff that he wrote and composed, I think it's shall we say, a sublimation of the urge of composition.
For all its many sections, it's really one sonata allegro movement with 3 very clear sections: the exposition, the development, the recapitulation, and a coda, which alone is over 300 bars long. And as you can imagine, all this takes about 35 minutes. It didn't completely come off. 3 years of my life went into this thing, and I'm extremely proud of it. But it didn't completely come off, first of all, because I didn't know at that time many things that I ought to have known about what the strings can and cannot do in terms of niceties of technique. And I was thinking again in terms of a blank instrumentation, really. But on the whole, I'm very pleased with it, because I had one idea in mind, which I think to a point came off, and that was to build a work in which one small motivic cell, in this case one of 4 notes being this, would to a large extent govern all of the themes and all of the motives of principal importance in the entire work. And in fact, whole sections are based upon nothing but this motive put in every conceivable light and upside down and backwards and all kinds of things. And this was, in a sense, a heritage from the 12-tone people whom I had studied and admired very much. At the same time, idiomatically, what I did was to try and fit this notion into a harmonic texture that could have been written by anyone in 1890, really. I think this fact shocked a great many people who had expected something very different from me.
It wasn't easy to be Glenn Gould. I think he hugely enjoyed many aspects of what he was able to do. He loved doing a great deal of it, not the public concertizing part of it. He also, I think, enjoyed being a part of the excitement and confusion of contemporary music. How many musicians are there who asked the kinds of questions he asked about what is music? Why do we make it? What is becoming of music? Where's it going? He didn't dismiss Muzak with a few glib phrases, as so many people do. Something is happening when we're having music every minute of our lives. What is happening to us? Why is this happening? What kind of music is it going to be? He didn't deny that these new forms of communication are there because we apparently want them.
With all his seriousness, with all his thoughts and what he put down on paper, I mean, some of the things he wrote, I even today don't understand all the words he uses. Maybe it was the influence of McLuhan. I remember we had once we had Glenn Gould, McLuhan, and a great friend of ours from India at a house. And the conversation started, and it was thrilling to listen to that conversation. And McLuhan held forth, and I really didn't understand. And I said to him, "Can you say this just in plain English?" And he said, "I don't think so." And Glenn laughed, of course.
It's my view that in the electronic age, the art of music has become much more viably a part of our lives, much less an ornament to them, and consequently changed them much more profoundly. Marshall McLuhan, the director of the University of Toronto's Institute of Culture and Technology, has done a great deal of research into the question of audience participation in the electronic media, and he's achieved quite extraordinary insights into the way in which it determines the participational level of the audience.
The tendency of the audience, as it becomes more and more participant, is to eliminate content in the ordinary sense. Just as in abstract painting, representational content tends to go out. As the painting becomes more and more cartoon-like and abstract, this permits a very much higher degree of do-it-yourselfness and involvement on the part of the viewer. It demands that he do a great deal.
Glenn was very visual, in spite of the fact that he hated being up there in a concert platform. Or said he did, and he did, I think. It's interesting, you think of three of the great superstars of his period when he started out as an international superstar in the late 1950s. You think of, at least I do, three: Leonard Bernstein, Elvis Presley, and Glenn Gould. Three of the most memorable visual images in the musical world. You can't forget them. But the point is that in a curious way, although one thinks of Glenn with music, you also visualize him. Now, he was visible on television and will be for many, many years to come. We've done these 22 half hours of his CBC performances, repackaged and new sound, digital sound. But in fact, although his visual sense was certainly secondary to his oral sense, I don't think there's any question that Glenn communicated to the world partly visually.
I think his genius was for communication, actually. I think he made music communicate. He was obsessed with the idea of communication. His work in radio, I think, confirms this. He wasn't just a musician. He was a broadcaster. He was a producer. He was a searcher. And the fact that he limited access to himself probably says something about meaningful communication and, how many people in your own life you can actually have meaningful communication with.
You see, he really chose his life, and he really fashioned it. But whether it was because of his needs or whether because of his desires, whatever, he still went ahead and he said to himself, I guess, this is the way I want to live. This is what I'm going to do, and so on and so forth. And now that takes a great deal, I think, of courage and strength to begin with, even to map it out and do it, think about it. And then he really did that in spite of many, like, there's so many people who always said, how crazy he was, how bizarre he was and all that. And that, those things did bother him. I mean, I know, nobody likes to be thought that he's off the wall, really. He was not beyond the fact, he may have been a genius, but it was not beyond the fact of being hurt or distressed by certain criticism, either of his lifestyle or of his thoughts or anything. But to me, it's the strength of purpose. I think it was first-hand knowledge of somebody who had an incredible strength of purpose. And he did it. I found that very inspiring, and I still do. I really do. I find even now that occasionally, if I have times when I'm at a loss of, sense of direction or something, I will think back about sometimes and things and think of Glenn or whatever. I found it very inspiring to be around a person who actually was able to be that strong and that courageous, really, in the conviction of his ideas.
He was a genius. He was a giant. He was an extraordinary musician, even if one doesn't like everything he did. I didn't like his Mozart at all. I had always the feeling he thought too much into it. But when you come to the Bach or some of the great Beethoven sonatas, it's an incredible achievement. A giant in his profession, an unusual giant. He was one of our heroes, I would really say.
All the musicianship, the insights, the abilities, the physical abilities, they seem to be built in. And it's like trying to define a mathematical genius, You can't, but they know it all before anyone taught them, more or less. It's just a matter of them developing. I think. I just always thought that we were all jolly lucky to be in the same world with Glenn,
If you look at the music, you look at the way he made music, you're left with the realization that it really does speak, and it speaks at a very high level. I mean, to listen to Glenn play Bach is an experience which convinces you that it really is the voice of Bach communicating that music. And I think that was the special nature of his way of making music, that it was perfect. It had been conceived in a way that the communication was complete, and it was direct. And I think that's his genius.
Glenn Gould and Bach. Irresistible, unforgettable. Many thanks to the contributors to this program on Glenn Gould, singers Lois Marshall and Roxolana Roslak, impresario Nicholas Goldschmidt, musicologist Harvey Olnick, and from CBC Radio and Television, Vincent Tovell, Ken Haslam, Lorne Tulk, Janet Somerville, and David Yeager. At the National Library, Helmut Kuhlman and Stephen Willis. And of course, this program would have been impossible to produce without the assistance of CBC Archives, and we thank Gail Donald and Jan Cornish. Program excerpts were from At Home with Glenn Gould, Prospects of Recording, The Idea of North, and Music of Today. Tonight's program was produced by Malcolm Gould and Donna Cressman Dubois. Our technician was Barry McAlishan.